This is a tutorial in Photoshop where we are going to learn to shade a sphere like this. So it may seem like this is oversimple and boring, but you'll learn a lot of skills that are going to apply to the bigger picture when you're drawing things. On the technical side, it'll deal with layers. You will learn to use a clipping mask. You'll learn to do some color sampling and to adjust brushes, like both in the opacity and the flow of the brush, as well as the size and hardness. We'll also look a bit at the blur and smudge tool, I think. And on the artistic side, you'll learn the parts of a shadow. You'll learn more about shading forms, how to choose color, and we'll look a little bit at making things really refined versus leaving some texture to it as well. First, I would like you to look at this. This is a photograph of a sphere, and we can see the different parts of the shadow clearly visible in this. So the light is coming from this direction. You're always going to need to know your light source when you're shading something, because shadows happen because of light, right? And as we move away from the light source, it gets darker, 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 darker. As best visible up here, like it starts light, it gets darker, 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 till we reach our darkest shadow right here. It doesn't get darker, darker, darker on this direction because of the reflection, and we'll get into that there. And one thing that's very important to notice when we're shading a rounded object is that a lot of times I see people, they have their sphere, they kind of cut it in half, they shade this half dark and they leave this half light, and you can see that the shadow is not straight across. It actually curves like this because the ball is curved, of course. So the shadow is going to curve with it. Keep that in mind as we're doing this. We're going to look real quick at the shadow parts. I'd love for you to learn these, so if you're so inclined, repeat this part as many times as necessary to actually learn the parts of the shadow so you can get better at shading. But we start over on the bright side. These would be our highlights, where the light is hitting pretty directly. Then it moves across into this area where basically the light just gets gradually darker. It just smoothly goes from a lighter area to a darker area, and these are what we would call our mid-tones. Then we get into the darkest section, and this is the shadow core. I'm just going to write core. The shadow core, where it gets the darkest that it's going to be on the whole thing. Now, typically, if this was on a black sheet of paper or there was no light coming from anywhere else, the shadow core would go all the way down and fill in this whole place. That everywhere down here would be completely dark. But it is on a very light surface, so what we get is the light from over here is hitting the table, it's bouncing back onto the ball there, or the light is hitting over here on the table and is bouncing back in this direction. And so we get all of this lighter area where, oddly enough, even though this is on the opposite side of where the light is, this area is actually as light as like this area out here. So we call this our reflected light, and that's about it. Sometimes if the ball is like super shiny, if you're working with a very reflective material, you might have like a direct reflection right here where you can actually see the glare of the lamp shining on there, and it's like pure white. And then we move down to this part. This is not actually on the object itself, but whenever you have multiple objects interacting, like a sphere and a table, you're also going to get a cast shadow. And if you happen to have a couple of spheres together, this sphere in front is going to cast some of its shadow onto the other sphere, and you get all kinds of crazy things happening. So learning to understand how light moves and works is pretty important. You'll even notice on the cast shadow that there is a darker section here, and it gets slightly lighter as it moves away. This is like our occlusion shadow in here, where there's pretty much no light getting in here because it's this little crevice between the sphere and the table. But as it goes out here, it gets lighter and lighter, and in this section you can see where the shadow is just kind of fading away. And that also you can adjust to make your picture look different. If it's a soft light, where it's kind of fuzzy and blurry, you'll get this really gradual edge that's super soft. If it is a single bright light bulb kind of far away shining directly on it, you're going to get actually a really hard edge here. It'll go from dark to light pretty quickly. So these are the parts of our sphere that we're going to need to know as we're shading it so that we can get it correct.